To my dearest friends, I am honored to welcome you back once more for today's special investigation into a world ruled entirely by the green-skinned brutes of the Orks. The brutally barbaric species exists as an ever-present plague within our galaxy, with there being little chance of us ever being free from their relentless wars launched purely for the sheer thrill of getting stuck in with a good battle. Every faction has fought against the Orks at one point or another, and yet it is doubtful that any have ever turned their attentions to the actual lives of the boys to learn of the day-to-day passings of the feral louts. In general, Orks will typically live within one of three places. Some will feel the call of the stars, and so will choose to occupy vast space hulks or ramshackle crafts within a large freebooter fleet. Others will live as feral survivors upon worlds controlled by rival factions, typically finding refuge within dense jungles or out in the wastelands, from where they can launch small raids upon the larger settlements. But the most common home for their kind will be found upon a planet which has been entirely claimed and conquered by the greenskins, producing what we shall aptly name as an Ork world. Quite often, these worlds will have once been owned by a different faction, yet would have fallen beneath the relentlessly overwhelming hordes of the Orks, looting and blasting all in their path until none but the war boss himself could claim total dominance. But once claimed, the planet will be transformed, with structures and buildings to be torn down, producing vast fields of scrap from which the intrepid mechs will sift through in order to construct their own bombastic workshops, and maybe even a shanty town for the other boys to squabble over. The boss will typically bash a few of the pesky runts over the head before forcing them to build him a grand throne, fit only for a warlord who could call an entire world as his home. But there is much to see within an Orky settlement, and so today, my dearest friends, I shall be taking you on a daring tour across a green-skin world known simply as Borkus. We will begin with an overview of the planet itself, showcasing its war-torn landscapes, its makeshift Orky reconstruction projects, and the patchwork of tribal districts owned by the various clans who vie for dominance over this war-torn hellhole. We will then delve deeper into the beating heart of their society by touring the planet's capital city known as Da Big Town, and of the sprawling industrial zone, where mechs produce gubbins and knickknacks, all for the price of a few big teeth. Finally, we will move out of the Orky metropolis, touring the shanty outskirts, dominated by Orks too weak or too boneheaded to find their place within the bustle of the city. The bravest of these, however, will set out into the wilds of this world, joining with the barbaric groups of beast boys, or with the adrenaline junkies of the speed freaks. But with this in mind, I do believe that it is now time for us to begin. Please do be careful as we journey through this world. Keep your hands and feet inside the truck at all times, and try not to attract the attention of the locals as we take a tour upon the riotous Ork world of Borkus. When viewed from orbit, Borkus appears as a scabrous brownish-green orb with large oceans of polluted waters, siding great masses of a landscape marred by the scars of an endless conflict. Vast craters pockmark its surface, with some marking the final orbital bombardments against the planet's former defenders, and others being caused by the explosive antics of the Orks themselves. This world used to boast a series of towering hive cities, but almost all of these have been reduced into varying states of ruin, with the greenskins caring far more for the loose scrap over anything else. With that said, the Orks must live somewhere, And so we will still find a scant few of the hive cities standing tall, though they are certainly in quite a shambolic state when compared to their old imperial glory. They no longer pierce up to brush against the clouds, as the mechs toppled these towering masterpieces long ago, choosing to rebuild outwards, forming a vast urban sprawl of shanty homes, tents, and dilapidated living quarters for the many boys. Here and there, if we were to look up, we might still be able to make out the angular outlines of collapsed hab blocks and half-melted spires, but these have since been patched up with sheets of corrugated metal and with the propped-up hulls of scrapped vehicles. The world has literally been built upon the wreckage of war, with the Orks seeing opportunity within even the smallest scrap of iron. Shattered roads were torn up and repurposed to build bumpy racetracks, sometimes being so crude that the bikes and trucks will rarely be able to complete a single lap before careening off into the crowds. Collapsed manufactorum districts have been gutted, their valuable content stolen by the mechs, leaving the structural husk to be converted into open-air forts, claimed by the vying bosses of the various clans. The atmosphere within these shanty cities is marred by a permanent haze, being a thick mixture of gunsmoke, industrial smog, and spore-filled dust, giving the sky an ominous yellow-green tint as the sun struggles to break through. But across Borkus, Ork settlements have sprung up like hardy weeds. Rather than one unified metropolis, this world is dotted with several major strongholds, each effectively ruled by a different Ork clan and their respective boss. These territories are like realms of their own, being bound together quite loosely under the overall tyranny of the planet's largest war boss, yet they are still fiercely proud of their unique clan identities. For example, on one continent rises a squat yet sprawling fortress named as Gorgholm, which was constructed by the mean and green Orks of the Goth clan. Legends say that the city was named after the war cry of the leading boss, who suffered from a speech impediment after getting whacked over the head by an irate grot. But that story is neither here nor there. In any case, it is little more than a gigantic defensive camp, sporting walls built out of the reinforced rubble of the original hive city, since painted with the Goths' checker box pattern of black and white. Gorgholm's streets, if one could call the open spaces between piles of debris streets, double as fighting pits for the battle-hungry boys, with there being few activities to engage in other than to fight and to brawl. In stark contrast to the crude practicality of the Goths, the Bad Moons clan have transformed a coastal city into what we might identify as an Orky trade hub. The Bad Moons are renowned for their wealth and love of ostentation, and so it was only natural for their stronghold to serve as an extension to their extravagant lives. Being named as Port Shiny on account of all the gold, the rusted-out seaport now boasts the largest markets of Borkus, with boys from every clan engaging in boisterous barter, swapping everything from captured weapons to exotic squigs or fungus brew, all to be had for the price of a few sharp teeth. Of course, even this merchant city often devolves into violence, with most colorful negotiations quickly erupting into great shootouts. But the Bad Moons wouldn't have it any other way. After all, what's the point in wealth if not to fund a good scrap? Far to the east, sprawled across a flat desert plain, is the domain of the Evil Sons, the speed freaks who are utterly obsessed with going fast, and little else. Their territory doesn't look like a city, so much as a chaotic tangle of dusty roads, weather-beaten garages and open expanses turned into makeshift drag strips. The evil sons have creatively named the flats as Red Rock Crossing, on account of all the rocks which they painted an eye-searing red so as to mark their territory. But here, speed is king. Clouds of exhaust and dust billow into the sky as countless ramshackle vehicles roar across the flats, engines pushed to the very brink by the daredevil boys behind the wheel. Red Rock Crossing has no real walls. Instead, it's encircled by a ring of wrecked vehicles half buried in the sand, like the bleaching bones of some mechanical graveyard, marking the territory where any outsider is far more likely to be run down before they ever see an orc on foot. Not all of the orc settlements on Borkus were once glorious cities, as one of the largest actually grew out of a colossal junkyard. Near the equatorial belt lies Scrapton, the stronghold of the Death Skulls. This area was originally the site of a waste disposal facility for the old Imperials, but where humanity saw garbage, the Orks found treasure. Under Death Skull rule, Scrapton has become a veritable paradise for looters and scavengers, with the piles of twisted metal, broken war machines, and ambiguous glowing waste all being cobbled together to form the groundwork to their new settlement. Of course, such is the nature of a Death Skull, that it is not uncommon for a fiendish boy to steal the foundations right out from under a building, leading to an unintentional demolition job, with all the scrap promptly to be stolen by opportunistic looters, eager to sell it on for a hefty profit. The Blood Axes, noted for being quite un-orky by most conventional standards, dwell within an old planetary defense network, found up in the jagged mountains, though they are yet to give it a name, since to them, if a place is unnamed, then it cannot be found upon a map. Interestingly, the boys have heavily camouflaged their fort by draping netting and mottled green tarp over the entrances, but it's a shame that the boneheads have used green, making themselves far more visible against the grey backdrop of the mountains. Beyond the boundaries of the clan-ruled enclaves stretches the rest of Borkus, with the snakebites and beast boys typically laying claim to the outer wilderness, since it is absolutely brimming with wild squigs and roaming bands of independent Gretchen. Conflict amidst the steppe is incredibly common, as the speed freaks also consider themselves as the rulers of any open landmass, thus leading to great clashes between the squighog riders and the warbikers. The terrain out here, though not marked by industrial sprawl, has also been ruined by the decades of orc occupation. What little remains of the grasslands have been churned to dust beneath the endless treads and stampedes of the boys. Craters from the old battles have formed watering holes which the orcs let their squigs drink from, despite the fact that the water is stained with the unhealthy tinge of chemical green. Here and there we will find the husks of destroyed vehicles, harboring small mobs of orcs not suited for a life within the big cities, but content to stare up into the stars each night. The native wildlife is incredibly scarce after being hunted to near extinction by the beast boys, but their environments have since been claimed by the various subspecies of the squigs, who have comfortably filled their required niche. Far in the distance, we might even see patches of dense fungal growth clinging to the ruined buildings and sprawling fields of rock. These are clear signs that the orcs have sunk their roots deeply into the world itself. Even the few regions not actively inhabited by the orcs are far from untouched, as the very soil and air has been seeded with their fungal spores, ensuring that Borkus will stay green for the rest of its days. Like any world, Borkus does boast a capital city, with the Orks considering it as the jewel of their growing empire, though it is difficult to apply the term jewel to a place largely composed as rubble, scrap metal, and unidentifiable slime. Once known to its original inhabitants as Hive Galmeda, the conquering war boss, after entering its gates, scratched his big chin and decided that a far more suitable name would simply be Dar Big Town, likely named because it is indeed a town which is big. Approaching the city's outskirts, the first thing to greet us would be the towering gates, welded together from the wreckage of Imperial tanks and civilian vehicles, thrown up hastily to form a crude perimeter wall. Much of the original city's lower superstructure still stands, but it has since been improved in typical Orky fashion, which is to say, being reinforced here and there with random girders and armor plates, then festooned with graffiti and grisly decorations. Massive glyphs painted in red, green, and other eye-watering colors proclaim this area as Ork territory, with human skulls and cadaverous trophies dangling across the ramparts, a none too subtle warning to any would-be invaders. A pair of enormous doors, which were once the blast shields to a spaceport hangar, stand ajar, and through them flows the constant traffic of Orks, grot servants, and rumbling war trucks belching out plumes of dense black smoke. Knobs loiter around the entrance, occasionally demanding a toll from the newcomers, but this is often just an excuse for them to bludgeon the teeth out of some poor Ork's mouth before tossing them back out into the wastes. Fortunately for us, we should be able to slip in unnoticed amidst a convoy carrying some rather pungent squigs, which the knobs would rather not sift through, to find any uninvited guests. But inside Dubbig Town's perimeter, one is immediately hit by an onslaught of intrusive sensations. The air is thick with smoke from the countless fires and makeshift forges, tinged with the coppery smell of blood and the musky stink of the squig pens. Noise is everywhere, a deafening cacophony of the guttural shouts of argumentative boys, the rapid crackle of gunfire from an Ork testing his new shooter, and from the constant metallic clang of crude hammers on unbending metal. The main promenade of the city has since become a chaotic bazaar, but the roadway is only so wide, occasionally forcing battle wagons to steamroll their way through the market, much to the chagrin of the working Orks below. Over the booming clamor of the city, we can just about hear a mob of bad moons haggling with a death skull looter over some second-hand guns, quickly to be drowned out by the surprisingly loud shrieking of a shrill Gretchen, selling piping hot portions of their squig on a stick. The little blighter, however, is sadly run over mid-sentence by an impatient biker who simply couldn't see the poor Gretchen's stall through his entirely occluded goggles. A few Orks pause in their bartering to shake fists or shoot off a half-hearted slug at the reckless biker, but then it's quickly back to arguing about the price of a few reliable grenades. Moving further in, we will pass through the various clan districts that make up the Shanty metropolis. Unlike the other cities upon Borkus, which are largely homogeneous by clan, here the Orks live shoulder to shoulder, often stoking the inevitable conflict between rival groups. In an old factory courtyard standing atop a pile of rubble, we will find a particularly muscled Goff Knob, acting as something between a drill sergeant and a referee, bellowing at two juvenile Orks engaged in a bare-knuckle duel below. If one bleeds, the watching crowd roars in approval. If one dies, the crowd roars even louder, before a group of grot orderlies drag away the corpse, likely destined for some Mad Doc's operating table. Just a few streets over, the scenery shifts as we wander into what clearly must be the turf of the Bad Moons. Gaudy yellow scraps of cloth flutter from every post and overhang, while the dull clink of teeth changing hands is more common than the sounds of conflict. The Orks here are slightly smaller than the Goths, but are bedecked in much more ornamentation, boasting gold-capped teeth, polished shoulder plates, and trinkets aplenty. Interestingly, this district contains something which resembles a tavern, being a large hall set up in the shell of an old administratum building. In the back, a few inebriated snakebites will be distilling a crude yet extremely potent fungus beer to be sold by the bucket. This is probably the closest thing to a leisurely social venue to be found within the city, but fights still break out like clockwork when someone has one beer too many or boasts too loudly of his wealth. Through all the districts and down all the back alleys scurry the lowest of the low, the snots and the grots. In the big town, the average orc will treat these little blighters as both servants and vermin, depending entirely upon the current needs of the boy and of the capabilities of the dastardly creature. You'll see grot attendants desperately trying to scrub an especially large war truck clean, under the barking orders of a mech, only for the orc to lose his patience and boot the unfortunate pest into a nearby pile of garbage. Elsewhere, grot chain gangs will lug heavy ammo crates on their backs, hustling to deliver munitions to their masters, all the while nervously glancing around for potential hiding spots should an orc suddenly decide he's in a kicking mood or that he's desperately hungry. But with there being so many orcs in the city, there is only so much space upon the streets for the grots to roam, and so, more often than not, the poor, unloved creatures will end up being trampled, with the disgruntled boy then being forced to scrape a grot-shaped smear off of his brand new boots. But at the center of Dabbig Town, dominating the skyline, we will find the war boss's swanky new palace, built out of the husk of the Grand Spire, which once held the personal quarters to the old planetary governor. Towering above the surrounding slums, it's quite a miracle that the upper levels survived the war, but what once gleamed in the midday sun is now entirely unrecognizable as a piece of human engineering. Gargantuan glyphs, sporting the war boss's personal symbol of a bloody fist, have been erected as plating to cover the facade, while any exposed regions have been peppered with bright flags, often planted by younger orcs as a challenge to climb the great tower. There are no real windows anymore, just blasted-out walls, which now flicker with bonfires through the night, though occasionally flashes of weapons fire can be seen to illuminate the smallest of cracks and gaps between the facade. Warboss Borkus, who naturally named this planet after himself, resides in the upper reaches of this lofty stronghold. The lower levels of the spire have been gutted, opening up into something crossed between a throne room and an arena. Much of his time will be spent here, sitting upon his ostentatiously large throne, crafted from the mashed remains of the governor's old adamantium desk, mangled betwixt the ruined armors taken from a squad of Astartes Terminators. Whenever the boss grows bored, which is quite often, he will simply roar out an order, and some hapless individuals will be dragged out to fight within his personal pit-fighting ring. Sometimes these are captive enemies, disobedient orcs, or creatures caught from the wild, but all will fight and all will die for the amusement of the boss. It is said that Borkus's booming laughter at the spectacles can often be heard echoing out through the night, only just drowning out the screams of the unwilling combatants. But having survived our stroll through the big town, it is now time we move on, with our next destination lying just beyond the heart of the city, where the clamour of industry beckons, and where even more wonders and dangers await. If the big town is the beating heart of Ork society on Borkus, then the industrial zone is its iron muscles and mechanical guts. Located just on the outer reaches of the capital, in what used to be the Hive's vast manufacturing district, this area has become a non-stop workshop for war and for fun. Even before we approach, the skyline of this region is obviously dominated by makeshift cranes and gantries jutting into the air, lifting and moving chunks of scrap towards unfinished mechanical wonders. The sound of the place will hit you long before you see it, with a cacophony of clanging metal, whirring drills, and the occasional earth-shaking boom, sending flocks of carrion birds scattering. Thick plumes of black smoke rise from thousands of chimneys and open furnace pits, merging into sooty clouds that hang low over the zone, painting everything in filthy shades of grime. From time to time, these clouds will open up into a deluge of acid rain, washing away the scum and the muck below, with the polluted overflow draining down to flood the distant shanty towns, much to the delight of the sadistic docks. But here, in this industrial zone, the mechs rule supreme. Countless workshops sprawl across the ruins of ancient factories, each one a hive of frenetic activity, producing mechanical contraptions so fantastical that by all standards of engineering should simply never function. Wander down any path between piles of junk, and you'll witness scenes that would make a Mechanicus tech priest faint. To your left, a one-eyed mech boy with a welding torch the size of a grox is fusing together two halves of completely unrelated vehicles, perhaps in an attempt to create a six-wheeled tank truck hybrid. Sparks fly in every direction as a gaggle of Gretchen assistants frantically pump a set of bellows to keep his crude forge blowing hot. To your right, under a sagging shed roof, two mechs argue heatedly over a schematic drawn in the dirt at their feet. One of them wants to mount a captured Imperial laser cannon onto a looted tank chassis, but the other insists that it would be far more fun to strap rockets onto the whole thing and to make it into a makeshift missile. Their debate is punctuated by colourful Ork profanity and the occasional smack of a passing grot catching stray flack for simply bringing his very slappable head into the vicinity of such an important argument. It's honestly quite a miracle that anything coherent comes out of these workshops at all, yet astonishingly they do produce functional, if not utterly ramshackle machines of war. Raw materials are the least of their worries, with scrap metal and loose parts being piled everywhere in towering, seemingly endless mounds. Of course, if they ever need a specific gubbin, then the mechs can just send out a scurrying horde of grots to sift through the junk, or to go and trade with the Death Skulls over in their town of Scrapton. To pass the time, a particularly bored mech might ask one of the more moronic of odd boys to go and find him a good shooter stretcher, a left-handed grenade, or even a can of checker box paint. This is all for a bit of fun, but it can be quite perplexing when the numbskull returns with exactly what was requested, until, of course, the mech realizes that a sneaky Death Skull has scammed his apprentice out of a few hard-earned teeth. In any case, whenever the mech needs some equipment, he can just turn his attention to the vast piles of scrap, roughly sorted by the little grots, and by their ferrosquigs, which are beasts with a weakly magnetized hide, often used to easily transport metallic debris from out in the wastes. Engine parts will be in one heap, armor plates in another, and random, unidentifiable bits will be tossed into a catch-all pile that some mech will no doubt find a use for eventually. In truth, it doesn't really matter if the parts in this pile aren't the perfect fit for a project, as the odd boy will just hammer them out and reshape them until they best suit his needs. Also, if a new construction fails to produce anything of worth, then the Orks can just bash it to bits and toss all the scrap back into their piles, thus producing the closest thing the greenskins have to a renewable resource. Walking through the workshops, we must be extremely careful where we step and when we duck. At any moment, a sudden explosion might erupt from a shed where a mech boy is testing out a volatile fuel mix, and indeed, to our left, a great mushroom-shaped fireball is indeed billowing into the clouds, though the delighted cackling of the boys seems to indicate that this was intentional and not an accident. In another direction, an improperly secured rocket fires off with a great whoosh, streaking across the yard and exploding against a stack of scrap, causing a rain of metal debris. Despite all the apparent chaos, no Ork appears to cease in their working. Some look up, raising their brows to all the excitement, before letting off a deep guffaw at all the foolishness, before getting back to whatever diabolical and nonsensical project they were working on. Amidst the organized madness, we can be sure that some truly fearsome war machines will be taking shape. Over in one clearing, previously used as an assembly hall, a group of big mechs are seen collaborating on the construction of a stomper, a titanic combat walker which could almost be equated to a mobile fortress, built upon two stubby little feet. The skeletal frame of the stomper towers high above, surrounded by cranes manned by boys who are struggling to hear the mechs yelling their orders from down below. Dozens of other boys can be seen crawling across the hull, welding on armor plates or rivet gunning heavy shooters in place, while a huge cauldron of molten metal boils nearby, tended to by a line of grots who scoop ladles of the shimmering liquid into exposed joints. Though in truth, the little bastards might be doing more harm than good here. Periodically, one of the big mechs will bellow out for everyone to clear away, before he flips a massive switch to test some part of the behemoth, at which point a giant mechanical arm might whir into life, or the stomper's belly gun might let out a thunderous crump, just to prove that it can fire. Not far off, another mech will be found adding the finishing touches to a Deaf Dread, which is a smaller combat walker piloted by a deranged Ork who must be hardwired into the internal machinery. This Dread, equipped with a buzzsaw arm, can be seen slamming itself against a concrete barrier, stomping around like some kind of restless oxen. A gaggle of Gretchen, with little else to do, repeatedly throw nuts and bolts at the caged contraption, until, of course, the barrier gives way and the Dread lumbers out to chase down the pesky little creatures. The tiny herders squeal and dive for cover as the Deaf Dread tromps off in the direction of the big town, probably to cause some kind of murderous ruckus. It could be hours before someone bothers to catch it, but no one seems very worried. It'll only be a problem if it steps on something really important, like the boss's shiny new bike. Away from the hustle and bustle of the big town and past the boundaries of the industrial zone lies a sprawling expanse of ramshackle camps and crude homesteads, and these, my dearest friends, are the Outskirts. Here, the dense urban ruins give way to a shantytown that stretches out towards the horizon, continuing for countless miles, before eventually thinning out into the desolate frontier of the wilds. The transition is hardly marked, and there is no signage to indicate that we have left the central districts. one will simply notice that the buildings have grown smaller, are more spaced out, and far more haphazard in their construction. Makeshift huts built from corrugated metal sheets and chunks of rockreet are clustered in semi-organized tribal grounds, rarely to be enclosed by walls or palisades, leaving the area to simply blend and meld with the many neighboring communities. These settlements house the greenskins, who for one reason or another live outside of the true city. Many are snakebites, meaning that they will cling to the old ways of Orky life, but others might simply be too poor, too feral, too simple, or too ornery to reside under the direct eye of the war boss's goons in town. Life here is incredibly varied, with the Orks closer to the city living more of an impoverished life, whereas those on the distant outskirts will be a bit closer to living a frontier existence, in that the Orks must be rough, self-reliant, and steeped in their own form of tribal camaraderie. Scattered around, we will find numerous squig pens, fungus farms, and snotling pits, all of which will sustain the communities of the outskirts. Unlike the scrounging, looting, and trading-based economy of the city, these Orks will breed and grow their own food and resources. Enclosures made of scrap fencing will hold writhing masses of squigs of all sizes, ranging from the dog-sized squig hounds, snapping and yapping, to the boar-sized squig hogs, which some Orks will ride as mounts into battle. One might even find a few squiggiths amidst the slums, but only the most stupidly imbecilic of Orks would ever think that they could contain a gargantuan beast in their ramshackle holdings without it breaking free and stampeding through the village. Runt herders will strut about as the petty kings of the outskirts, each boasting a healthy herd of squigs and snotlings to be traded away for teef or to be thrown into the stew pot come nightfall. Most of their caretaking takes the form of the Ork prodding away at the squigs with a large grabber stick, or by throwing heaps of fungal stalks to be eaten. But still, this is certainly better than nothing. If anything, it's a mucky and far more chaotic version of ranching, with the Orks raising each squig to maturity, fattening them up before deciding whether to eat it, fight it, or to ride it into battle, sometimes doing all three, though not quite in that order. Nearby, patches of cultivated fungus sprout up amidst piles of squig-based fertilizer, often watched over by sleepy-looking snakebites, accompanied by a gaggle of mischievous-looking snotlings. Once fully grown, the fungi may be brewed into a potent drink, tossed to feed the squigs, or used for medicinal purposes, though in truth, most Ork medicine can be summated by a doc handing you a suspicious-looking mushroom and simply hoping for the best. Carefully strolling through the tribal outskirts, we will quickly notice how different the atmosphere is from the city. The Orks here wear more pelts and animal hides than of scrap metal armor, and many of them will sport tattoos or war paints made from squig dyes. Their weapons, while still shooters and choppers, often possess more of a primitive flair, being decorated with beast teeth or etched with the glyphs of one's tribal group. Moving deeper, we would be lucky to not be seen by a trio of burly snakebites squatting around a small fire pit outside a hut, roasting chunks of some mysterious meat skewered upon a spit. It is said that the rough, outdoorsy upbringing of the snakebites makes them into some of the toughest of Orks to be found, with legends saying that most will be able to headbutt a wild Grox unconscious before ever picking up his first shooter. Given the forehead scars on some of these lads, I don't doubt that they test this theory quite regularly. Of course, though this might sound quite idyllic, life within the outskirts is not always easy for the Orks. Every boy must look out for themselves, as in the dusty back streets and unmarked tents, all manner of shady dealings and bizarre experiments will be sure to flourish. In one corner of the camp, we can spot a partially ragged tent marked with a crude red cross and the glyph of a bone saw, the telltale sign that this is the domain of a mad doc. The pained groaning of some half-sedated, half-conscious orc may be heard within, broken up only by the sounds of whirring buzzsaws, hacking chops of an axe, and the cackling laughter of the doc himself. If we were to discreetly peek inside, we would be met with a scene from a feverish nightmare, with the mad doc, clad in a blood-splattered apron, hunched over an orc patient lying on a wooden table. The patient is clearly unconscious, or perhaps dead, it's hard to tell, and the doc is cheerfully hacking off whatever's left of the poor lad's right arm. A Gretchen assistant stands by with a large metal prosthetic, though it is clearly too heavy, and his little knees can hardly stand the weight of the rusty appendage. In the corner, another orc, fresh from surgery, staggers to his feet, groaning in pain from a newly installed bionic eye that's spinning and sparking uncontrollably. The doc belches and hollers at him, "Oi! Come back here! I ain't calibrated that yet, you git!" as the hapless fellow blunders through the tent flap. It's all very crude, but this is medicine, orc style. Needless to say, results vary wildly. Some patients emerge as fearsome cyborg warriors with steel jaws and buzzsaw arms, while others emerge as abominations, mistakes to be sedated and tossed into the squig pits so that the beasts may absolve the doc for his crimes against all of orc kind. Further along, near a cluster of boulders that form a natural arena, we stumble upon a rowdy squig fight. Dozens of orcs have gathered in a rough circle, yelling and placing bets in the form of teeth and shiny trinkets, while in the middle, two massive squigs are being goaded into a vicious brawl. An enterprising grot weaves through the crowd to take any wagers, offering up impossibly unlikely parlays to the boys who care for the thrill of the game more than their own fiscal security. Of course, if a lad runs out of teeth in his pocket, he could always ask the grot to pull them out of his own jaw, thereby keeping him in the game for just one more bet. But behind the squig pit, concealed by the shadows of a rickety lean-to, we notice a group of Gretchen engaged in a whispered and rather sneaky-looking conversation. They glance about furtively as they pass a small object between them. An object which looks an awful lot like a rusty old revolver. One grot, sporting a makeshift red bandana, seems to be addressing the others in a low, passionate hiss. Could this be the seed of some rebellion? There are often hushed legends upon orc worlds, shared between the little underlings of a certain rebellious hero known as the Red Gobbo, who will one day emerge to lead the grots in an uprising and to seize freedom from their orky overlords. Watching these particular grots, one might almost imagine that they're plotting something along those lines. Although maybe they only want to steal a few extra rations. With grots, it's always hard to tell. Whatever it is, they scatter like leaves in a storm when an orc comes stomping near, their subversive little conclave dissolving instantly into innocent whistling and busybody nothingness. If indeed they were dreaming of a revolution, it will have to wait for another day. Amid such scenes of everyday pandemonium, one can almost forget that an entire planet's worth of orcs lives further out, far beyond the limits of established civilization. As we venture out, the camps of the outskirts gradually blend into the greater wilderness, with the spaces between encampments growing larger and larger, until finally we pass the last permanent hut and realize that now all that lies ahead is the open dark of the wilds. Now, we venture into the wilds of Borkus, the untamed regions beyond any greenskin settlement or governance, where only the fiercest beasts and the boldest of orcs dare to roam. Out here, the landscape stretches raw and scarred under a relatively clear sky, only partially covered by the drifting clouds of pollution constantly churning out of the industrial hubs of the various cities. We must march over plains of hard-baked earth, cracked by past orbital strikes and littered with the rusting skeletons of war machines from battles long past. Gnarled stretches of woodland have since been overgrown and outpaced by the fungal sprawl, producing dense patches of sinewy stalks topped by pale, sickly caps. In the distance, jagged hills and cliffs rise, perhaps concealing caves or the remnants of old mining networks, now likely inhabited by isolated commandos who don't realize that the war has long ended. The old roadways can guide us through parts of the wasteland, but much of the asphalt was torn up and moved to produce racetracks for the speed freaks. So at some point, we will be forced to abandon our path and to follow the dusty tracks of squigs, migrating to some greener pasture. Each step further from the outskirts feels like peeling away another layer of civilization, such as it was, only to move deeper into the primordial and lawless frontier. Without the bustle of the camps, the sounds of the wilds will dominate our senses, with the moaning wind carrying distant engine revs and animal cries. Beneath that is an eerie silence. One moment it is so quiet you can hear your own breathing, but the next, the ground trembles from the approach of something large, prompting us to dive for cover and hide behind a conveniently tactical rock. Looking up in time, we will witness a thundering convoy of the speed freaks, blazing past along the nearby road at truly breakneck speeds. This mob of the evil sons is made up of orcs who were incompatible with the unmoving existence of a static camp, and so took to the open range with their beloved vehicles. There are perhaps a dozen war buggies and bikes kicking up a massive dust cloud behind them. They travel in quite a loose formation, like a pack of hunting predators, occasionally breaking into small races with one another, vying to be at the head of this riotous storm. These orcs live for the road, but every so often one of the buggies, decorated with spikes and a shark-toothed grin painted on the chassis, will swerve abruptly, trying to bump a fellow rider off course in a high-stakes game of chicken. Further down the line, two of the bikers pop a wheelie and fire their shooters high into the air, celebrating Gork knows what. Perhaps they just raided a rival camp, but maybe they're simply drunk on the raucous thrills of speed, mixed with the intoxicating warmth of a good mug of fungal beer. But just as quickly as they arrived, the convoy disappears, leaving only dust and the fading echo of their revving engines. This is an incredibly common sight in the wilds, with roving bands of the speed freaks using the open terrain as their own personal racetracks, caring for little more than the simple goal of moving faster and faster. A few hours' trek beyond, we will come across some evidence of the other dominant faction of the wilds, the nomadic beast snaggers. Deep gouges in the earth and footprints large enough to sit within signal that a herd of huge creatures just passed this way, and accompanying them, a host of hunters. Cautiously following the trail, we will soon spy the nomads in action. Cresting a hill, peering down into the broad valley below, we will be met with the sight of a truly titanic battle of Ork versus Beast. The feral Ork tribe, perhaps 50 strong, has cornered a truly gargantuan squig near a dried-up riverbed. This creature is a squiggoth, a monstrous variant of the common squig, grown to be as large as a house with a hide like cracked leather and massive tusks to smash and impale its attackers. At the forefront of this battle is the beast snagger leader, a huge boss perched atop the back of his own scaly squigosaur mount. With one hand, he clutches the reins, but the other is held into the sky, revealing the immense cybernetic power claw, replacing his entire arm up to the shoulder. Barking out orders, the boss is merely trying to corner the wild beast so that he can claim the kill for himself, as it would be quite the embarrassment for the biggest orc to not bag the biggest beast upon Borkus. Lashing from side to side, the squiggoth roars in pain as a burly orc thrusts a spear directly into its exposed underbelly. One unfortunate orc and his squig mount are caught by a sweeping tusk and sent flying through the air like rag dolls, crashing into the earth with a sickeningly wet thud. The other hunters laugh, appreciating the thrill of the fight, even if it results in their mates getting squished. Finally, the beast makes a critical mistake. Blinded by rage, it charges straight at the warband's leader, opening itself up from all sides. The cunning boss, however, stands his ground until the last possible second, before yanking hard on his own squigosaur's reins. The surprisingly agile mount sidesteps deftly, but the squiggoth plows forward, momentarily overextending itself. In that moment, the boss dives down, clasping his giant power claw around the skull of the creature, and with all his might clenches down, bringing the open claw into a closed fist. With a sickening crunch, the squiggoth's hardy skull is crushed, exploding out in a spew of unidentifiable brain matter, bone, and blood, before the beast collapses down to its side, raising up an immense cloud of dust. Victorious howls erupt from the orcs as they converge on their fallen prey in an excited mob. Some whoop and dance, while others immediately start hacking off trophy pieces. A tusk here, a chunk of horn there, while the other boys help their boss to get his claw dislodged from the beast's great skull. The boy who was flung against a rock miraculously staggers back into the fray, bloodied but grinning, and is promptly greeted with a hearty smack on the back and a slab of squiggoth meat to get his teeth around. But we must carefully slip away from the valley before the celebratory orcs notice our silhouette upon the ridge. Trekking further, we encounter more landmarks, including a collapsed bridge over a dry gully, serving as a makeshift ramp that a speed freak gang has clearly been using for daredevil stunts. But judging by all the scrap beneath it, most of these jumps seem to have ended in disaster. In a marshy lowland, we briefly spot a cluster of truly feral orcs. Independent from any clan, these primitives wear little more than ragged loincloths and wield only stone-tipped spears, chasing down small, gamey squigs amidst the mud. What makes the wilds truly menacing is the complete and utter unpredictability of its dangers. In an orc town, we would at least know the general rules and would see any obvious dangers coming towards us, but out here, threats can spring up from anywhere, at any time, in any form. One moment, we find ourselves crossing a seemingly peaceful clearing, dotted with strange glowing fungi. The next, those fungi start popping with loud bangs, sending us diving for cover as green spores explode like fireworks. On another occasion, we decide to skirt around a canyon that emanates an odd mechanical grinding noise, but peeking within, we realize a gargantuan drill from a void ship lies half buried here, occasionally spitting gouts of flame as its damaged plasma drives randomly cycle. There are also tales of rogue creations wandering these lands. For instance, a Kilakan that lost its pilot, but keeps clanking on, possessed by some bizarre echo of the grot's will, ambushing lone orcs by night, in the hopes that it will one day encounter the Doc, who first entrapped him within this metallic cage. But of course, the most dangerous game of the wilds is still the orcs themselves. Warbands frequently clash in the wilds for no reason other than crossing paths while in a particularly irate mood. Stumbling upon the aftermath of one such skirmish, fought within a rocky pass, reveals the still burning husks of a few ragged vehicles, sided by splatters of blood, still drying beneath the setting sun. We can be sure that two groups of orcs must have quite recently had a grand old time of bashing each other to pieces, with the victors having looted what they could, before moving on, deeper into the wastes. It's truly quite a savage existence out here. Only the most brutally cunning or cunningly brutal of orcs can survive for very long. And yet, thanks to the spores, the population will never dwindle, leaving the wilds well stocked with some of the most adventurous, albeit foolish, of boys. As night falls across the wilds, a new atmosphere descends. The daylight dust and haze give way to a murky darkness, broken only by the distant fires of roaming camps or by the headlamp beams of a speeding war buggy on some far-off dune. We see the glow of one such bonfire on a hilltop and hear faintly on the wind the raucous sounds of an orc camp at rest. If, of course, you can call drunken brawling and poor musical performances with a squig pipe as rest. Those orcs are likely freebooters or clanless wanderers gathering for mutual protection overnight, and by morning they'll scatter again, perhaps in twos and threes, to chase whatever dreams took their fancy in the night. For us, the darkness is a cue as well, a reminder that we have now pushed our luck to its very limits. To wander further into the wilds at night would be, frankly, suicidal. Every rustle in the gloom, every distant engine rev or alien screech is enough to set our nerves on edge. The imagination conjures up all manner of grim fates, of being run down by a joy-riding truck we never saw, or being snapped up in the jaws of some night-stalking squig looking for a late supper. As such, it is time to conclude our perilous tour and to slip back towards what passes for safety nearer to the core of the big town. As we take one last look at the wild horizon, streaked with the smoke of far-off fires and the faint green auroras of weird boy energy dancing in the sky, one thing is certain: Borkus in its wilds is every bit as alive, violent and bizarre as in its busiest of settlement. The orcs of this world are truly free to live as they see fit, free to race, free to hunt, free to fight and free to die, under the strange stars of this world, subject to no laws, beyond their own search for a good fight. And so, my dearest friends, we have now come to the end of our grand tour of the planet Borkus. We have ventured from the thundering heart of Darbig Town to the frenetic forges of the industrial zone, through the gritty fringe camps of the outskirts and into the untamed wilderness of the wilds beyond. Truly, the sight of a world ruled entirely by the orcs would produce stories that few imperial scholars would believe, and yet we have seen firsthand how an orc society, if it can be called as such, functions on near every level. But for now, as we prepare to quietly depart from Borkus on a borrowed shuttle, concealed by the cover of darkness, I must now express my deepest thanks for listening to this tale in its entirety, and that I shall soon return with yet another tale from the grim darkness of the far future. I will now bid you all with a very warm goodbye. And may our next meeting be under calmer circumstances than of the chaotic bustle to forever rage on Borkus.